This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. Um, Part 1. The night everything finally cracked open began with cake, candles, and the quiet certainty that my family believed I was powerless. My father's house stood at the edge of our small town like it always had. Large, white, carefully polished, the kind of place that looked respectable even when the people inside it were anything but. Through the front windows, I could see the warm glow of lights and the slow movement of familiar silhouettes. Laughter drifted out each time the door opened. It was my father's birthday, 70 years old, and the whole town had practically been invited. Old neighbors, distant cousins, former co-workers, church friends. In a town like ours, events like this were less about celebration and more about reputation. Appearances mattered, and my father had always cared deeply about appearances. I paused at the bottom of the driveway, hands in the pockets of my coat, watching the house where I grew up. 5 years had passed since I'd last stepped inside. 5 years since I learned exactly what my own family was capable of. 5 years since the day my future quietly disappeared. Inside that house tonight, sitting comfortably at the dining table, was my younger brother, Daniel, the golden child, the boy who had never been told no, the boy who somehow ended up with $175,000 that had never belonged to him. Most people in town believed the story my parents told, that I had been irresponsible, that I had walked away from college, that I had wasted my opportunities and refused help. They whispered about it in grocery store aisles and church hallways. Some of them probably still thought I had been ungrateful. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the college fund meant for me had quietly vanished before I ever had the chance to touch it. Gone. Gone. Transferred, rewritten, and handed to Daniel. My father had done it with the same calm confidence he used when signing birthday cards. Back then, when I confronted them, they had looked at me like I was being dramatic, like I should simply move on. Like the loss of $175,000, years of my grandmother's savings, was just an unfortunate misunderstanding. They thought I would accept it. They thought I would stay quiet. They thought I would struggle alone while Daniel used my future to pay for his. For a while, they were right. I struggled more than anyone in that house would ever admit. 2 jobs, community college night classes, cheap apartments, and cheaper dinners. Meanwhile, Daniel posted photos from campus parties and spring break trips, smiling in front of buildings my tuition had helped pay for. And my father still sent Christmas cards pretending everything was normal. I took a slow breath and walked up the driveway. Inside, music played softly and the smell of roasted food drifted through the hallway when someone opened the front door again. People were gathering around the dining room table now. My father stood near the cake, smiling proudly while Daniel leaned casually against the counter like the evening belonged to him. No one noticed me at first. That was fine, because tonight wasn't about making an entrance. Tonight was about something far more interesting. Across the room, sitting quietly near the window, was the one person in that house who knew the truth. Grandma. Her silver hair was pinned neatly behind her ears, her sharp eyes watching everything like they always had. When she saw me standing in the doorway, she didn't look surprised. In fact, the corner of her mouth lifted slightly, almost like she had been waiting. The conversations around the room continued, unaware of the storm quietly walking through the door. My father hadn't seen me yet. Daniel certainly hadn't, but Grandma had. And when our eyes met across the room, she gave the smallest nod, which meant only one thing. Tonight, the secret that had been buried for years was about to come out. And this time, the entire town was going to hear it. Part 2. For a moment, I stayed near the doorway, letting the scene unfold the way it always had in this house. People laughing too loudly, glasses clinking, my father standing at the center of it all like the respected pillar of the community he had spent decades convincing everyone he was. If you didn't know the story behind that smile, you'd think he was the kindest man in town. That was the genius of it. My father had always understood something most people didn't. If enough people believed you were good, the truth became inconvenient background noise. The dining room table had been extended to fit nearly 20 guests. Plates were stacked neatly, candles flickering across the polished wood surface. Neighbors I had known since childhood sat shoulder to shoulder with relatives who had once watched me grow up. Most of them hadn't seen me in years, which made this even better. Daniel was the first one who noticed me. He turned while laughing at something one of his friends said, and the moment his eyes landed on me, the smile froze on his face like someone had pressed pause on a movie. It took him a second to process it, then another. Then the color slowly drained from his cheeks. Daniel had always been expressive. Even as a kid, he could never quite hide his reactions. And right now, standing there with a half-empty drink in his hand, he looked like someone who had just seen a ghost walk into the room. He nudged our father's arm. My father turned casually. At first, his expression held mild confusion. Then recognition arrived, and with it came something sharper. I watched the exact moment he realized this wasn't a coincidence, because I hadn't been invited. The music kept playing, people kept chatting, but a subtle shift spread across the room as a few conversations quieted and heads began to turn. Small towns remember faces, even after 5 years. Someone near the back whispered my name. I walked slowly toward the dining room, the wooden floorboards creaking softly under my steps. Every movement felt strangely calm, like I had already lived through this moment 100 times in my head. My father straightened his jacket. The performance mode had activated. He stepped forward with that practiced smile people in town trusted so much. "Well," he said warmly, loud enough for others to hear, "look who decided to stop by." There was just enough friendliness in his voice to make it seem welcoming. Just enough distance to remind everyone that I had been gone. Eyes around the table flicked between us. My brother remained frozen near the counter. I stopped a few feet away from them. 5 years earlier, this room had felt suffocating when I confronted them about the money. Back then, I had been younger, angrier, desperate to be believed. Now I just felt steady. My father studied my face, clearly trying to calculate why I was here. "You could have called," he said, still smiling for the audience. I glanced around the room. Some guests looked curious, others looked uncomfortable. And near the window, Grandma was watching with quiet focus, her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for the exact right moment. "I didn't want to interrupt the party," I said calmly. Daniel shifted his weight. My father chuckled lightly, the way people do when they're trying to keep things normal. "Well," he said, gesturing toward the table, "you're here now." A few people nodded politely, but the tension in the air was starting to grow. Because even if they didn't know the full story, everyone in that room knew something had happened between us years ago. Families don't stop talking to each other for half a decade without a reason. My father leaned slightly closer to me. His smile faded just enough that only I could see it. "What are you doing here?" he muttered under his breath. I looked at him. Really looked. The man who had signed away my future like it was an inconvenience. The man who told everyone I had simply walked away from opportunity. And for the first time since I was a kid, I noticed something new in his eyes. Uncertainty. I glanced past him toward Daniel, then across the room toward Grandma. She gave another small nod. The signal. Perfect timing. Because the cake had just been placed on the table, candles glowing while guests gathered around to sing, which meant the entire room had gone quiet. Everyone was watching. And that was exactly the moment I chose to speak. "I figured tonight was the right time," I said evenly. My father frowned. "For what?" I folded my hands together. And after 5 years of silence, I finally said the words my family had hoped no one in this town would ever hear. "It's time people found out what really happened to my college fund." The room went completely still. And across the table, Daniel nearly dropped his glass. Part 3. The silence that followed felt thick enough to touch. Even the music in the background seemed to fade into nothing as the words settled over the room. A few guests glanced at each other, confused. Others stared directly at my father, waiting for him to laugh it off the way people in his position often did when something uncomfortable surfaced in public. My father didn't laugh, not right away. For the first time that night, the carefully rehearsed warmth slipped from his face. His jaw tightened slightly, the way it used to when I was a kid and had said something he didn't like in front of company. Daniel set his glass down on the counter a little too quickly. The faint clink of it against the marble sounded louder than it should have. "What are you talking about?" my father said after a moment. His tone had changed. The friendliness was gone now, replaced by something measured and controlled. The kind of voice people use when they're trying to contain a problem. But the problem was already standing in the middle of the room. I looked around at the guests. Mrs. Harper from down the street was sitting near the end of the table, her eyebrows raised. Old Mr. Collins leaned forward slightly in his chair, like he had just sensed the beginning of an interesting story. People in small towns are good at recognizing tension, and they rarely walk away from it. "I'm talking about the $175,000 Grandma saved for my college," I said calmly. A ripple passed through the room. Someone shifted in their chair. Another guest quietly cleared their throat. The number alone was enough to draw attention. My father let out a short breath, shaking his head like this was some kind of misunderstanding that needed correcting. "We've already talked about this," he said. His voice carried that familiar tone he used when explaining something simple to someone stubborn. "You chose not to go to the university we discussed. You decided to do things your own way." A few people nodded slowly, clearly recognizing the version of the story they had heard before. I almost smiled. Of course that was the narrative. It always had been. I turned slightly so everyone could hear me better. "That's not what happened," I said. The words landed softly, but their effect was immediate. My father's eyes narrowed. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, looking everywhere except at me. Across the room, Grandma still hadn't moved. She watched the scene with the quiet patience of someone who had already seen the ending of this story. "You walked away from your opportunity," my father continued, a bit louder now. "We supported you, but you." "No," I interrupted. That single word cut through the room. People stopped shifting in their chairs. My father stared at me. "You didn't support me," I said evenly. "You transferred the money." The sentence hung in the air like a dropped glass that hadn't shattered yet. Daniel's head snapped toward me. My father's expression hardened. "That's enough," he said quickly, but the timing was wrong, because someone at the table had already asked the question everyone else was thinking. "Transferred it to who?" The voice belonged to Mrs. Harper, and suddenly every eye in the room turned toward my brother. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, then looked helplessly at our father. For a second, my father didn't say anything. His mind was clearly moving fast, trying to steer the conversation somewhere safe. But the room had already shifted. People weren't just listening anymore. They were watching, really watching. The kind of attention that strips away polite excuses. My father finally spoke again. "The money stayed in the family," he said firmly. The phrasing was careful, deliberate, but it wasn't a denial. A murmur spread around the table. I could see the realization starting to form in people's minds, piece by piece. I slowly turned Daniel smaller now somehow, standing near the counter like he wanted to disappear into the wall. "That's right," I said quietly. The candles on the birthday cake flickered between us. $175,000. I paused just long enough for the number to settle again. Transferred into Daniel's tuition account. The room erupted into whispers, and my father's face finally lost all color. Part 4. The whispers spread through the room like wind through dry leaves. At first, they were quiet, soft murmurs between neighbors who had known our family for decades. But whispers in a small town travel fast, and curiosity is stronger than politeness when something unexpected happens in front of 20 witnesses. My father could feel it. I saw the exact moment he realized the room had stopped being his stage, because people weren't looking at him with admiration anymore. They were looking with questions. Daniel shifted again near the counter, rubbing his palms against his jeans. He had always hated attention unless it was praise. Right now, every set of eyes in the dining room felt like a spotlight. "This is ridiculous," my father said sharply. The calm performance from earlier had disappeared. His voice carried a firmness meant to shut things down quickly. "It's my birthday," he continued, gesturing toward the cake like it should settle the matter. "This isn't the time or place for old misunderstandings." But the problem with saying that in a room full of curious people is that it rarely ends the conversation. It usually fuels it. Mrs. Harper leaned forward slightly, resting her elbow on the table. "I didn't realize their misunderstanding," she said carefully. Across from her, Mr. Collins nodded slowly. "You always told us your eldest decided not to go to school," he added. More heads turned toward my father. The tension in the room tightened like a rope being pulled from both ends. My father exhaled slowly, the way someone does when they're trying to regain control of a situation slipping through their fingers. "That's correct," he said. "They chose a different path." His eyes flicked toward me, warning and irritation mixing together. I knew that look well. Growing up, it meant drop it, stop talking, handle things privately. But tonight wasn't about private conversations. Tonight was about the truth finally stepping into the light. "I didn't choose a different path," I said calmly. "I chose a school." Daniel's shoulders stiffened, and I was accepted. More whispers. Someone near the end of the table quietly said the name of the university under their breath. It was a good school. Everyone in town knew it. My father crossed his arms. "That school was too expensive," he replied quickly. It was the first new excuse of the night, and it landed badly. Because several people at the table knew exactly how much money had been set aside for my education. My grandmother had been proud of that fund. She had mentioned it often during church dinners and neighborhood gatherings over the years. $175,000, saved slowly, carefully, for me. Mrs. Harper frowned. "But didn't Margaret start that account when they were little?" she asked. "Margaret? Grandma?" Every head turned toward the window where she still sat quietly. My father followed their gaze. And for the first time that evening, a flicker of concern crossed his face. Grandma had not spoken yet. But she also had not denied anything. She simply watched him. Then she looked at Daniel. Daniel swallowed. My father noticed the shift in the room and tried again. "That money was family savings," he said firmly. "I decided how it was used." The phrasing was stronger this time, more defensive. But it had also confirmed something important. He hadn't denied the transfer. Across the room, someone muttered, "So it did go to Daniel." The whispers grew louder. Daniel's face turned red. "I didn't ask for it," he suddenly said. The words burst out of him before he could stop them. The room froze again. My father turned slowly toward him. Daniel immediately looked like he regretted speaking. But the damage had already been done, because people weren't whispering anymore. They were staring at my father, staring at Daniel, and starting to piece together a story that didn't match the one they had heard for 5 years. I let the silence stretch just a little longer. Then I said the one thing my father never expected me to say in front of this many witnesses. "I didn't just find out what happened to the money," I said quietly. My father's eyes snapped back to me. "I proved it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "What does that mean?" Mr. Collins asked. I looked directly at my father. "It means the bank records still exist." Daniel's breath caught. My father's face went completely still, and across the room, Grandma finally began to smile. Part 5. The smile on Grandma's face was small, but in that moment, it was the most powerful thing in the room, because everyone there knew her. Margaret Whittaker had lived in that town longer than most of the guests had been alive. She had volunteered at the library for 30 years, organized church fundraisers, and personally delivered casseroles to half the people sitting around that table when their families went through hard times. If there was one person in town whose reputation was beyond question, it was her. And right now, she looked like someone who had just heard the opening line of a story she had been waiting years to finish. My father noticed it too. His shoulders stiffened. "That's enough," he said sharply, his voice louder now. "This conversation is over." But he was speaking to the wrong room, because people weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at Grandma. Mrs. Harper turned in her chair toward the window. "Margaret," she said carefully, "is there really a college fund?" Grandma slowly placed her teacup on the table beside her chair. The small ceramic click echoed through the quiet room. Then she stood. For 82 years old, she moved with surprising steadiness. Her back was straight, her steps calm as she walked toward the dining table where the rest of us stood frozen. My father watched her like someone watching a storm roll across the horizon. "Mother," he said quietly, a warning hiding beneath the word. But Grandma had never been particularly concerned with warnings. She stopped beside the table, resting her hands gently on the back of a chair. "Yes," she said. Her voice was calm, clear, and it carried easily across the silent room. "There was a college fund." The whispers returned instantly. I saw Daniel close his eyes for a moment like he hoped the floor might open beneath him. My father inhaled slowly. "That money was family savings," he repeated. "We've already discussed—" "No," Grandma interrupted. The word cut through his sentence like a knife, and that alone was enough to shock half the people in the room. Because Margaret Whittaker had always been polite, gentle, careful with her words, until now. "I started that account when my oldest grandchild was 5 years old," she continued. "Every month I added to it." She glanced toward me. "For college." Several guests nodded slowly, clearly remembering those conversations over the years. My father's jaw tightened. "That was before circumstances changed," he said. Grandma turned her eyes toward him, and for the first time that night, the softness disappeared from her expression. "What circumstances?" she asked. The question hung there, heavy. My father didn't answer immediately, because there wasn't a good answer. Daniel looked like he wanted to sink into the counter behind him. I watched the entire room lean closer without actually moving. Grandma continued. "I asked you to manage that account because I trusted you," she said to my father. Her tone wasn't loud, but it was steady enough to silence every whisper in the room. And one day the balance disappeared. Someone gasped quietly. My father straightened his posture. "It was reallocated," he said firmly, another careful word, another attempt to soften what had happened. Grandma tilted her head slightly. "Reallocated to who?" The room went completely still again. My father opened his mouth, closed it, then finally said the one thing he could no longer avoid. "To Daniel." The reaction was immediate. Several guests began murmuring loudly now, no longer bothering to hide it. Mrs. Harper looked stunned. Mr. Gay Collins shook his head slowly, and Daniel stared at the floor like it had suddenly become fascinating. Grandma let the noise settle for a moment. Then she asked the question that truly mattered. "And did the child that money was meant for agree to that?" My father didn't respond. He didn't need to, because everyone in the room had just watched the answer unfold. The silence stretched long enough to become unbearable. Then my father turned toward me, his patience finally gone. "You've made your point," he said coldly. "Now leave." The room froze again. 5 years ago, I probably would have. 5 years ago, I still believed that confronting him meant something. But tonight was different, because tonight wasn't just about exposing the truth. Tonight was about something else entirely, something my father still hadn't realized. I met his eyes, and said the sentence that turned the entire situation from family drama into something far more serious. "I didn't come here just to talk about it," I said calmly. His expression darkened. "Then why are you here?" I held his gaze. "Because the lawsuit was finalized this morning." Daniel's head snapped up. My father's face went pale. And across the table, someone whispered the words that instantly sent a wave of shock through the room. "You sued them?" Part 6. The word lawsuit hit the room like a dropped plate. No one spoke for several seconds. Not because they hadn't heard me, but because they were trying to understand what it meant. In a small town like ours, people argued, people gossiped, people held grudges for years over fences and property lines. But lawsuits inside families, especially public ones, were something else entirely. Daniel stared at me as if I had just set the house on fire. "You? What?" he said. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. My father didn't look confused. He looked furious. The kind of quiet fury that builds behind a clenched jaw and still shoulders. "You didn't," he said slowly. But his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I didn't rush to speak. Instead, I glanced around the room at the stunned faces, the neighbors who had watched me grow up, the relatives who had heard only one version of the story for years. Then I nodded once. I did. A low wave of murmuring swept through the guests again. Mrs. Harper pressed a hand against her chest. Mr. Collins leaned back in his chair, eyes wide with disbelief. And Daniel looked like someone had just pulled the floor out from under him. My father took one slow step toward me. "You're making a mistake," he said. The warning in his voice was unmistakable. But the time for warnings had passed years ago. "I filed the case 18 months ago," I said calmly. Daniel's mouth fell open. 18 months, he repeated. My father's eyes narrowed sharply. That detail clearly surprised him, which meant something important. He hadn't known. For a man who prided himself on controlling every situation, that realization hit hard. "You never received the notice?" I asked. The question sounded innocent, but it wasn't, because I already knew the answer. My father didn't reply immediately. Instead, he glanced quickly toward Daniel. Daniel looked completely lost, which confirmed the truth. The legal documents had been sent, but my father had kept them quiet. I could almost see the calculations racing through his mind now. If he admitted the lawsuit existed, everyone in this room would know the situation had gone far beyond a family disagreement. But if he denied it, well, that would be much harder now. "You're bluffing," he said finally. His voice was steady, but it lacked the confidence he had earlier. "You can't sue your own family over something like that." Several guests exchanged uncertain looks. People often believe that, until they learn otherwise. I reached into my coat pocket. Daniel leaned forward slightly. My father's eyes followed the movement carefully. I pulled out a thin folder, not thick, just a few neatly organized pages. But those pages represented 5 years of frustration, 2 years of legal work, and a very patient attorney who specialized in financial misconduct cases. I placed the folder gently on the table beside the birthday cake. The candles flickered from the movement. "It wasn't easy," I said. No one spoke. Every person in that room was watching. "The bank confirmed the transfer records," I continued. "The account was originally registered under Grandma's trust with instructions for my education." Grandma remained silent, but her eyes never left my father. "The funds were moved without my consent," I said, and the paperwork listed Daniel's university account as the recipient. Daniel's breathing had become noticeably faster now. He looked at my father again. "You told me it was a family decision," he said quietly. My father didn't answer him. He was staring at the folder like it was a snake. Mrs. Harper spoke again. "So what happened with the lawsuit?" she asked cautiously. I opened the folder. Inside were the final documents. Stamped, signed, official. "The court reviewed the bank records, the trust documentation, and the transfer authorization," I said. My father's voice cut in sharply. "Stop." But no one in the room wanted me to stop. In fact, several guests leaned closer. I slid the top page slightly forward so the stamp at the bottom was visible. The date. Today's date. "The judge ruled this morning," I said. Daniel whispered something under his breath. My father looked like he was about to explode. "And?" Mr. Collins asked. The entire room held its breath. I looked directly at my father before answering. "The court ruled the transfer was improper." The whispers came back instantly. "And the money?" Mrs. Harper asked. I closed the folder slowly. "The court ordered full repayment." Daniel's face went completely white. My father didn't move, didn't blink. Then he asked the one question that revealed he finally understood the real problem. "How much?" he said quietly. I met his eyes. $175,000, I said. I paused just long enough for the number to sink in. Plus legal fees. The room erupted into stunned voices. And across the table, my father finally realized something that made his hands slowly curl into fists. Because the entire town had just learned the truth, and the bill had finally arrived. Part 7. The room no longer felt like a birthday party. It felt like a courtroom. No one was eating. The cake sat untouched in the middle of the table, its candles now burning low, while 20 pairs of eyes moved between my father, Daniel, and the folder resting quietly beside the plates. In a small town, reputation is currency. And at that moment, my father's balance was dropping fast. "You're lying," Daniel said it first. Not loudly, not confidently. The words slipped out of him like someone grasping for the last piece of stability left in the room. His voice trembled slightly. "You can't just sue family and take money back," he continued. "That's not how it works." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked at him carefully. 5 years ago, Daniel had been 20, carefree, popular, surrounded by friends and university life that had always seemed just slightly too expensive for someone who claimed he was paying his own way. Now he looked older, but not wiser, just frightened. "The court didn't see it as family money," I said calmly. "They saw it as misallocated trust funds." Several guests exchanged confused looks. Mr. Collins spoke up again. "What does that mean exactly?" I rested one hand lightly on the folder. "It means once Grandma created that account with my name attached to its purpose, the money couldn't legally be redirected without proper consent." Grandma nodded quietly. "I made that clear when I opened the account," she added. The statement landed like a hammer because it removed the last possible excuse. My father exhaled slowly through his nose. "You're twisting things," he said. But even he didn't sound convinced anymore. Daniel looked back and forth between us, panic beginning to creep into his expression. "Dad," he said quietly. My father ignored him. His attention was locked on me now. "You dragged this into court instead of handling it like family," he said. I almost laughed at that. Almost. "For 5 years you told everyone I walked away from my education," I replied. "That doesn't feel much like family either." A few uncomfortable coughs sounded around the table. Mrs. Harper looked down at her napkin, because she had repeated that exact story to other people more than once. My father noticed the shift in the room, and it made him angrier. "You embarrassed this family tonight," he said sharply. I tilted my head slightly. "No," I said. "The court records did." That sentence triggered another wave of murmurs. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing a few steps across the kitchen floor like he was trying to process the math forming in his head. 175,000, he muttered, then he stopped walking. His eyes widened slightly. "Wait." He turned slowly toward me. "You said plus legal fees." I nodded. My father's shoulders stiffened again. Daniel looked at him, then back at me. "How much are the legal fees?" The question hung in the air. For the first time that evening, I almost felt bad for him. Almost, because Daniel hadn't orchestrated the original decision, but he had benefited from it. He had attended the university, lived in the dorms, taken the trips, posted the photos, and never once asked why my life had taken such a different path. 18 months of litigation, I said calmly. Daniel's face tightened. That doesn't answer the question. My father suddenly spoke. That's enough, he snapped, but Daniel ignored him. How much? he asked again. I opened the folder once more and slid the second page forward. The number was printed clearly. Official. Final. Daniel leaned closer. Then he froze. His lips moved silently as he read it again. Then he looked up slowly, disbelief flooding his expression. You're serious? I met his eyes. Very. He looked at my father. But my father didn't say anything. Didn't deny it. Didn't argue, which was answer enough. Daniel turned back toward me, his voice barely above a whisper now. That's over $200,000. The entire room went silent again. Because now everyone understood the scale of the situation. My father's reputation, Daniel's education, 5 years of lies, and a legal judgment more than most houses in town. I closed the folder gently, and across the table, Grandma folded her hands with quiet satisfaction. But the real shock hadn't even arrived yet, because Daniel was about to ask the one question my father had been desperately hoping no one would think of. Who exactly has to pay it? Part 8. The question lingered in the air like the slow toll of a bell. Who exactly has to pay it? Daniel's voice had been quiet when he asked it, but the impact was immediate. Several people around the table leaned forward again, curiosity overtaking whatever discomfort they had been feeling moments earlier, because the answer to that question mattered. A lot. My father didn't look at me. He stared at the folder, and in that silence, everyone in the room understood something important. He already knew the answer. Daniel noticed it too. Dad, he said. My father still didn't speak, so I did. The court ruled that the person who authorized the transfer is responsible for repayment, I said evenly. The words sounded simple, but they carried weight. Daniel blinked twice, slowly. Processing. Authorized the transfer. He turned toward my father, and suddenly the room felt very small. 5 years ago, Daniel had probably never wondered who actually moved the money. Back then, he had simply accepted the story that the family had rearranged things. But tonight, in front of witnesses and legal documents, rearranged things had become something much more specific. My father finally looked up. That account was under my management, he said. It sounded like an explanation, but it also sounded dangerously close to a confession. A murmur spread through the guests again. Mr. Collins rubbed his chin thoughtfully. So the court said you have to pay it back? He asked. My father's jaw tightened. That's not how family works, he replied. It was an answer that avoided the question entirely, and everyone noticed. Daniel certainly did. His breathing had grown noticeably uneven now. Wait, he said, looking between us. Are you saying Dad has to pay the whole thing? I didn't respond right away. Instead, I opened the folder again and pulled out the final page. The document was stamped with the court seal, official, final. I placed it gently on the table and rotated it so the text faced the room. The ruling states that the responsible party must restore the full amount plus fees, I said. Daniel leaned forward again, scanning the page. Then he found the line, the one with my father's name, and everything clicked. Oh my God. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Several guests shifted uncomfortably because now the story wasn't theoretical anymore, it was real. And it had a price tag. Daniel looked up slowly, his eyes wide with a new kind of panic. You didn't tell me about this, he said to my father. My father said nothing. Dad! Still nothing. Dad! The frustration in Daniel's voice cracked through the room. My father finally turned toward him. This is being handled, he said sharply. But the confidence from earlier had vanished. Daniel laughed once, a short, disbelieving sound. Handled? He said. $200,000 is being handled? Mrs. Harper quietly covered her mouth. Mr. Collins leaned back again, clearly realizing the evening had taken a turn none of them expected. Daniel ran both hands through his hair now. You told me everything was settled years ago, he said. My father's eyes flashed. Lower your voice. But Daniel wasn't listening anymore. You said the money was ours to decide, he continued. You said Grandma agreed. Grandma raised one eyebrow from across the table. The reaction did not go unnoticed. Daniel saw it, and the realization hit him like a cold wave. You didn't tell me the whole story, he said slowly. My father looked at him with growing irritation. I told you what you needed to know. The statement hung there, heavy, uncomfortable, and deeply revealing. Daniel took a step back from the table. So what happens now? He asked. No one answered immediately. The cake candles had burned down to small glowing stubs, dripping wax onto the frosting. Finally, my father spoke again. We'll appeal the ruling. It sounded firm, decisive, like the voice of the man everyone in town believed he was. But my attorney had predicted that response months ago. I shook my head slightly. You can try, I said. My father narrowed his eyes. What's that supposed to mean? I met his gaze calmly. It means the judge already addressed that. Daniel looked up again. So, there's no appeal? I closed the folder. The ruling included a payment deadline. The room went silent once more. My father's expression darkened. What deadline? He asked. I let the pause stretch just long enough to make the answer land harder. Then I said the one detail that caused several guests to audibly gasp. 30 days. Part 9. 30 days. The number seemed to echo in the room long after I said it. For a few seconds, no one moved. The low murmur of conversation that had been filling the dining room all evening had vanished completely. Even the faint ticking of the old wall clock near the kitchen doorway suddenly sounded louder. 30 days. In a town where people sometimes took 6 months to argue over a broken fence, 30 days to produce more than $200,000 felt impossible. Daniel stared at the table, then at my father, then back at the document. You're serious, he said quietly. It wasn't really a question. My father finally pulled his eyes away from the folder and looked directly at me again. The anger in his expression had hardened into something colder now. You think you've won, he said. I didn't answer, because this wasn't about winning. It was about consequences. But my silence seemed to irritate him more than anything I could have said. This ruling doesn't mean anything yet, he continued. Court decisions get challenged all the time. Not this one, I said calmly. That caught the attention of several people around the table again. My father's eyes narrowed. And why not? I rested one hand lightly on the back of a chair. Because you didn't contest the evidence. The sentence landed like a quiet bomb. Daniel blinked. What evidence? I turned slightly so the room could hear. The bank records, I said. The transfer authorization forms. The trust agreement Grandma signed when she created the account. Grandma nodded again from the far side of the table. Daniel looked at my father. You didn't fight it? My father's silence answered the question, and that silence spoke louder than any explanation. Daniel's confusion quickly turned into frustration. Why wouldn't you fight it? He asked. My father exhaled slowly through his nose. Because dragging the family through a public trial wasn't necessary. Several guests exchanged looks at that statement. Daniel laughed again. But this time there was no humor in it. You mean like this? He said, gesturing around the room. A couple of neighbors quickly looked down at their plates. Because he wasn't wrong. At this point, the entire town might as well have been sitting at the table. My father straightened his shoulders. This should have been handled privately, he said. I shrugged slightly. I tried that 5 years ago. That reminder pulled a few quiet nods from the older guests. Some of them remembered the day I left town. The arguments, the rumors. My father's version of events had always sounded cleaner, simpler, until tonight. Daniel paced another few steps across the kitchen. 30 days. The math was clearly running through his head again. Dad, he said slowly, do we even have that kind of money? The question made several people shift uncomfortably. Finances are rarely discussed openly in small towns, but tonight, everything seemed to be spilling into the open. My father didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked back at the documents on the table like they might somehow rearrange themselves into a different outcome. We'll figure it out, he said finally. Daniel stared at him. That's not an answer. My father's patience snapped again. It's the only answer you're getting tonight. Daniel opened his mouth to argue again. But before he could speak, a new voice entered the conversation. Grandma's. "You had 5 years to figure it out," she said calmly. The entire room turned toward her. She was still standing near the end of the table, her hands resting lightly on the chair in front of her. My father looked at her with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "You're taking their side," he said. Grandma raised one eyebrow. "I'm taking the side of the truth." The statement landed with quiet authority. Daniel looked between them again, clearly realizing something he hadn't fully considered before. "Wait," he said slowly. He turned back toward me. "You said the court ruled this morning." I nodded. Daniel frowned. "So why announce it tonight?" The room grew still again. Because it was a good question, and everyone wanted to hear the answer. I glanced toward Grandma. She was watching me carefully, waiting. Then I looked back at Daniel. "Because tonight the whole town is here," I said. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. And my father finally understood what Grandma had been smiling about earlier. Because the lawsuit wasn't the only thing that had been finalized this morning. There was something else in that folder, something far more personal. And I hadn't mentioned it yet. Part 10. The room waited. No one reached for their drinks. No one spoke over each other anymore. The earlier shock had transformed into something sharper. Attention. The kind people give when they sense the story hasn't finished unfolding. Daniel noticed the shift immediately. "You said something else was finalized," he said slowly. His voice had dropped into a cautious tone now, the way someone speaks when they suspect another unpleasant surprise is waiting. My father's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I opened the folder again. The quiet rustle of paper sounded impossibly loud in the silent dining room. A few guests leaned closer in their chairs, pretending they weren't, but clearly unwilling to miss whatever came next. The second document slid halfway out. It wasn't as long as the legal ruling, only a few pages, neatly stapled. But the heading at the top was enough to make my father's face lose the last bit of color it had. Grandma noticed. Her smile returned. "What is that?" Daniel asked. I placed the pages beside the court ruling. "It's related," I said. My father stepped forward suddenly. "Don't." The word came out sharp and immediate. It was the fastest reaction he had shown all night. That alone made half the people in the room sit up straighter. Daniel looked between us again. "Dad, what is it?" My father didn't answer, which meant I would. 5 years ago, I said calmly, when I realized the money was gone, I started asking questions. Several people nodded slowly. That made sense. But the strange part, I continued, was how quickly the account had been emptied. Mrs. Harper frowned. "What do you mean?" "The full balance was transferred in one transaction," I explained. "Not gradually, not partially." I tapped the page lightly. One signature authorized the entire move. Everyone in the room understood what that implied. Daniel swallowed. "Dad signed it," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. My father crossed his arms again, clearly trying to reassemble his composure. "That's already been discussed," he said, but I shook my head slightly. "No," I said, "not this part." The tension in the room tightened again. Daniel glanced down at the new document. "What is it?" I turned the page slightly so the heading faced him. It took him 2 seconds to read it, then 3 more seconds for the meaning to sink in. "Wait." His voice trailed off. He looked at my father, then back at the paper, then at Grandma. "This is about the trust." Grandma nodded. "Yes." Several guests exchanged confused glances. Mr. Collins spoke up again. "What trust?" Grandma answered before I could. "The one that held the college fund." That part everyone already understood, but Daniel's expression was changing again, because he had reached the paragraph below the heading, and now his confusion was turning into something else. Shock. "Dad," he said slowly, "this says the trust had 2 conditions." My father's jaw clenched. Daniel kept reading. 1, the money must be used for the education of the oldest grandchild. He looked up. "That's you," he said to me. "Yes." Daniel looked back at the page again. And the second condition, his voice faltered slightly. The room leaned closer again without meaning to. Daniel read the line one more time. Then he lifted his head slowly toward our father. You didn't tell me about this part. My father didn't respond. Daniel's voice rose. This says if the trust funds are misused. The silence stretched. Daniel finished the sentence. Control of the remaining family estate transfers to Grandma. Gasps filled the room. My father's face went completely still. Mrs. Harper covered her mouth again. Mr. Collins whispered something under his breath that sounded like, well, I'll be. Daniel looked stunned. Dad, is that real? My father finally spoke. His voice was quiet. Yes. The room exploded into whispers again. Because suddenly the lawsuit wasn't the biggest issue anymore. Not even close. Daniel looked back at the document. But if the court ruled the money was misused, his eyes widened as the final piece clicked into place. Then the trust condition triggered. Grandma folded her hands calmly. Yes, she said. Daniel turned slowly toward my father, which means he couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone in the room already understood. The lawsuit had forced the truth into the open, and that truth had activated a clause my father had hoped no one would ever read out loud. I closed the folder gently and looked directly at him. That part was finalized today too. Part 11. For several seconds after I said it, the entire room seemed to forget how to breathe. The whispers that had been rolling through the dining room stopped completely. People weren't just surprised anymore. They were trying to process something much larger than a family dispute. Because what had just been revealed wasn't about a college fund anymore. It was about control. Daniel looked down at the document again, like the words might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. They transferred the estate? He asked quietly. Grandma answered with the same calm tone she had used all evening. Not transferred, she said. Returned. A few guests exchanged confused looks. Mr. Collins leaned forward again. What estate are we talking about exactly? The question was innocent enough, but everyone in the room knew the answer would matter. Grandma rested her hands lightly on the back of the chair again. Our family property, she said. Several heads turned instinctively toward the windows. Because outside those windows stretched the land my father had spent decades proudly showing off to anyone who visited. The house sat on nearly 10 acres just outside town, along with 2 rental properties near the main street and a small warehouse building my father leased to a local construction company. It wasn't a fortune compared to big cities, but in a town like ours, it was significant. Daniel clearly knew the value. His face slowly drained of color. You mean everything? He asked. Grandma tilted her head slightly. Everything the trust governs. Daniel looked at my father again, and this time his voice carried something new. Fear. Dad? My father hadn't moved. He stood near the table with his arms crossed tightly, staring at the documents like they had personally betrayed him. You went behind my back, he said to Grandma. His voice was low now, cold. Grandma didn't react to the accusation. You signed the trust agreement yourself, she replied. A few people murmured quietly at that, because if my father had signed it, that meant he had agreed to the conditions long before any of this happened. Daniel turned back to the document, scanning it more carefully now. This clause says the estate goes back under trustee supervision if funds are misused. He looked up. That's you, he said to Grandma. Yes. The confirmation landed heavily. Daniel rubbed his temples like the room had suddenly started spinning. So the court ruling basically triggered this. That's correct, I said. He let out a long breath. And Dad knew about it, Grandma answered before my father could. Yes. Daniel stared at him now. You knew? My father finally looked up. His eyes were hard. The clause was never meant to be used like this, he said. Grandma raised one eyebrow. It was meant to protect the grandchildren, she replied. Several guests nodded quietly at that. It was the kind of explanation that felt obvious once someone said it out loud. Daniel looked between them again, trying to understand the full picture. "So what happens now?" he asked. Grandma gave the same answer she had given the lawyers that morning. "The estate returns to trust management." Mr. Collins frowned slightly. "And what does that mean in practice?" Grandma glanced briefly at me, then back at the room. "It means major financial decisions require my approval again." Another ripple of murmurs passed through the guests, because everyone there understood something important. For decades, my father had been the one running everything. The house, the properties, the family finances. And now suddenly, that control had been taken away. Daniel realized it at the same moment. "Wait," he said. He looked at my father carefully. "You can't sell anything." My father didn't answer. "You can't refinance the properties either." Still nothing. Daniel looked back at Grandma. "And the rental income?" Grandma smiled faintly. "That now goes through the trust accounts again." Daniel's mouth slowly opened, because he was finally seeing the full picture. The lawsuit had forced repayment. The trust clause had removed control of the assets, and suddenly the man who had always acted like the most powerful person in the room was standing there with fewer options than anyone had ever imagined. My father's voice broke the silence again. "You planned this." The accusation was directed at me. I met his gaze calmly. "No," I said. Then I nodded slightly toward Grandma. "She did." The entire room turned toward her again, and she smiled the way someone smiles when a long game finally reaches its final moves. But even now, the biggest shock of the night still hadn't arrived. Because Daniel had just noticed something else in the document that made his stomach drop. And when he spoke again, his voice sounded completely different. "Dad, there's another line here." Part 12, Daniel's voice had changed. Until now, it had been anxious, confused, occasionally defensive. But this time there was something else in it, unease. The kind that comes when someone realizes the ground beneath them hasn't just shifted, it's cracking. Every head in the room turned toward him again. "What line?" Mrs. Harper asked cautiously. Daniel didn't answer her. He was staring at the page like it had suddenly started speaking back to him. His finger traced down a paragraph slowly, carefully, as if he was hoping he had misread it the first time. Then he swallowed. "Grandma," he said. "Yes?" "This clause says the trustee can appoint a new financial executor." Grandma nodded. "That's correct." Daniel's eyes flicked toward my father, then back to the document. "And it says that executor takes over management of the estate assets." Another nod. "That's also correct." The whispers started again, because now the implications were becoming impossible to ignore. Mr. Collins rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Well, if she's the trustee again, that makes sense." But Daniel still hadn't finished reading. "There's more," he said quietly. My father's shoulders stiffened. The tension around the table tightened again. Daniel kept reading. "The trustee may appoint an executor from among the beneficiaries, if doing so protects the long-term interests of the trust." The room went silent, because now everyone was beginning to understand where this was going. Daniel looked up slowly. "Grandma, who's the executor?" For the first time that evening, she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at me, just briefly. But it was enough. My father noticed the glance instantly, and the realization hit him like a punch. "No," he said. The word came out fast, sharp, but it was too late, because Daniel had already followed Grandma's gaze, and now he was looking at me. "Wait," he said slowly. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "You?" No one else spoke. No one else moved. The old clock near the doorway ticked loudly again. Grandma finally gave her answer. "Yes." The room erupted. Several guests began speaking at once, shocked murmurs bouncing around the dining room. Mrs. Harper gasped outright. Mr. Collins leaned back so quickly his chair nearly scraped the wall. My father took a step forward. "You can't be serious." But Grandma looked perfectly calm. "I am." Daniel's expression shifted between disbelief and confusion. "You're saying they're in charge now?" "Of financial oversight," Grandma clarified. My father laughed, but there was no humor in it. "This is absurd," he said. He turned toward me. "You think you can run this family's assets?" I didn't rise to the bait. I think the trust can, I said calmly. His eyes flashed. This is revenge, I shrugged slightly. This is paperwork. Several guests tried and failed to hide their smiles, because that answer landed harder than any insult could have. Daniel ran his hands through his hair again. So let me get this straight, he said slowly. He pointed toward the papers. The court says Dad owes over $200,000. No one disagreed. And the trust clause says Grandma controls the estate again. Another nod. And Grandma appointed you to oversee the finances. Yes. Daniel stared at me like he was seeing a completely different person than the one who had walked into the party an hour earlier. Then he looked at my father. Did you know about this part? My father didn't answer. Daniel laughed softly. A tired sound. You didn't. Grandma spoke gently this time. I signed the appointment this morning. My father's voice rose. You did that behind my back. Grandma met his glare without blinking. You emptied a grandchild's future behind mine. That sentence shut the room down again. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, because now the story had changed completely. 5 years ago, I had left this house with nothing. No college fund, no support, just accusations and rumors trailing behind me. And tonight, standing in the same dining room, in front of the same neighbors who had believed those rumors, the balance of power had flipped. Daniel realized it too. He looked around the room slowly, at the guests, at the documents, at Grandma, then finally at me. And the question he asked next carried a quiet dread that hadn't existed before. So, what happens to Dad now? Part 13, Daniel's question hung in the room longer than any accusation had. What happens to Dad now? The whispers stopped again, but this silence felt different. Earlier, the guests had been shocked, curious, maybe even entertained by the unfolding drama. Now the atmosphere had shifted into something heavier, because consequences were no longer theoretical. They were standing right there in the dining room. My father looked at me like he expected a verdict. For most of my life, he had been the one delivering those. Groundings, lectures, decisions about what was fair and what wasn't. Now the entire room seemed to be waiting to see if the roles had truly reversed. I didn't rush to answer. Instead, I picked up the folder and straightened the papers inside it slowly. The soft shuffle of pages sounded strangely loud in the quiet room. Grandma watched me calmly. Daniel watched me nervously. My father watched me with open hostility. Finally, I spoke. That depends on what he decides to do next. Several people leaned closer again. My father's eyes narrowed. What is that supposed to mean? I slid the top document back onto the table where everyone could see the court seal. The ruling gives 30 days for repayment, I said. Daniel nodded slowly. Right. If the payment is made within that period, I continued, the case closes. Mrs. Harper tilted her head slightly. And if it isn't? I looked at my father when I answered, then enforcement begins. The word enforcement had a weight to it. A few people in the room clearly understood what that meant immediately. Mr. Collins was one of them. He exhaled quietly. That means the court can seize assets, he said. I nodded once. Daniel turned pale again. You mean the properties? Yes. The room shifted again, because everyone in town knew those properties. The house alone had been in our family for nearly 40 years. Daniel looked at my father urgently. You have to pay it. My father's expression hardened. Don't tell me what I have to do. Daniel looked stunned by the response. Dad, this isn't pride anymore, he said. This is math. A couple of guests nodded quietly. Daniel gestured toward the papers. $200,000 in 30 days. My father crossed his arms again. I said, we'll handle it. But his voice lacked the certainty it had earlier in the evening. Daniel clearly heard it too. How? He asked. My father didn't answer, and the silence spoke volumes. Daniel turned back toward me. You're really going to enforce it? The question carried a hint of disbelief, as if part of him still believed I would stop the process now that the truth had been revealed. I held his gaze. It's already enforced? I said. That sentence made several guests shift uncomfortably again. Daniel blinked. What? The enforcement paperwork was filed with the ruling, I explained. My father's head snapped up. You did what? I met his eyes calmly. It's standard procedure. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. So if the money isn't paid, the court begins asset recovery, I finished. Another long silence filled the room, because everyone there could now see the full shape of the situation. 5 years ago, my father had quietly moved money he controlled. Now the legal system was quietly preparing to move something back. Daniel slowly lowered his hands, then he looked at Grandma. You knew this was going to happen tonight. Grandma smiled faintly. I suspected. Daniel shook his head slowly. This is insane. My father finally spoke again. You think you're clever, he said to me. I didn't respond. You think embarrassing me in front of half the town proves something. Still nothing. He stepped closer. But let me explain something to you. His voice dropped into that same tone he had used when I was younger. The tone meant to intimidate. To collect a debt like that, you need leverage. He tapped the table lightly. And you don't have any. For a moment, the room felt uncertain again because several guests weren't familiar with legal processes. Daniel looked at me, almost hopefully, like maybe his father had found a loophole. But I simply opened the folder again and slid the final sheet of paper across the table. The document had a different seal, different heading. Daniel leaned forward to read it. His eyes widened again. My father frowned. What is that? Daniel answered before I could. His voice came out barely above a whisper. It's a lien. The room went completely still, because now everyone understood, and my father finally realized something that made the color drain from his face. The leverage already existed. Part 14. The word lien settled over the room like a thick fog. Not everyone present understood every legal detail, but most adults knew enough to grasp the basic meaning. A lien wasn't just a warning. It was a claim, a legal stake placed directly on property until a debt was paid. And in a town where land and houses defined a person's status, that word carried weight. Daniel stared at the page. A lien on the property, he murmured. Then he flipped the document slightly, scanning the address line. His eyes widened again. On the house? I nodded. Yes. The silence in the room deepened. The house wasn't just a building. It was the centerpiece of the family's identity. Holiday dinners, summer barbecues, graduation parties. Almost everyone in town had stepped through its doors at least once. Mr. Collins spoke quietly. That means it can't be sold. Correct, I said. Mrs. Harper added cautiously, and banks won't refinance a house with a lien like that. Also correct. Daniel looked up slowly. So basically, the court locked the house down. That's the idea. My father laughed suddenly, but it sounded brittle. You think that scares me? He said. No one answered him, because the problem wasn't fear, it was math. Daniel was the one who said it out loud. Dad, if the house can't be refinanced, where does the money come from? My father's eyes flashed with irritation. I'll figure it out. But how? That question hung between them, because everyone at the table knew something about my father. He valued control more than anything. Losing financial flexibility, losing the ability to move money freely, was the exact kind of pressure the legal system designed. Grandma folded her hands. That is what consequences look like, she said calmly. My father shot her a glare. You orchestrated this? Grandma didn't flinch. No, she said. You did. A quiet murmur of agreement rolled through the guests. Daniel ran his hand across his face again, exhaustion starting to replace the earlier panic. So the house has a lien, he said slowly. He pointed at the paperwork. And the court can take property if the debt isn't paid. Yes. He looked at my father. And Grandma controls the trust again. Yes. Daniel exhaled. Then he laughed softly, but it wasn't a happy sound. You really boxed yourself in, didn't you? My father didn't respond. He just stared at the documents like they had personally betrayed him. Across the table, Mrs. Harper leaned closer to Mr. Collins, and whispered something that sounded suspiciously like, "This is going to be the talk of the town for years." Daniel seemed to hear it too. He looked around the room at all the familiar faces, neighbors, friends, people who had known our family for decades. Then he looked back at me. "So what do you want?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of the entire evening. Several guests leaned forward again, because that was the real mystery. Revenge? Justice? Humiliation? People often assume lawsuits are about punishment, but I had learned something during the past 18 months that most people never realize. The law doesn't care about emotions. It cares about resolution. "I want the money returned," I said. Daniel frowned slightly. "That's it? That's what the court ordered." My father scoffed a snipe. "You're pretending this is just about money." I looked at him evenly. "What do you think it's about?" He stepped closer again. "It's about making me look like a villain." I didn't answer, because the room itself had already reached its own conclusions. Daniel spoke before the tension could build further. "Okay," he said. He looked between both of us. "Let's say Dad finds the money somehow." Everyone turned toward him. "Then this all ends?" I nodded. "Yes." Daniel seemed relieved for half a second. Then he glanced down at the lien document again, and something else clicked in his head. His eyes moved slowly across the page. Then he looked up. "Wait." My father frowned. "What now?" Daniel pointed at the paper. "This lien isn't just on the house." The room froze again, because suddenly everyone realized they had assumed something that might not be true. Daniel swallowed. "It lists multiple properties." Mr. Collins leaned closer. "How many?" Daniel read the line again. Then he looked up at my father, and the dread in his voice was unmistakable. "All of them." Part 15. The birthday cake arrived just as the air in the room reached its breaking point. White frosting, gold lettering, my father's name written neatly across the top like nothing in the world had changed. But everything had changed. People in the room could feel it. My grandmother sat calmly at the end of the table, fingers folded together, watching the storm she had started ripple through the town's most carefully maintained family image. The mayor stood awkwardly beside the window, pretending to check his phone. Two of my father's business partners whispered to each other in low voices. My father tried to regain control. He forced a smile and lifted his glass. "Everyone, let's calm down. This is just a misunderstanding." But the word misunderstanding barely had time to leave his mouth before my lawyer stepped forward. Not quite. Silence slammed into the room again. My father's smile cracked. My mother's face drained of color. My brother looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under him. My lawyer opened a leather folder and laid several printed pages onto the table beside the birthday cake. The stack looked harmless at first glance, but those papers carried more weight than any secret my family had tried to bury. Financial records, bank transfers, account ownership documents, every piece of evidence connecting my father to the disappearance of my college fund. $175,000. The room leaned forward collectively. My lawyer spoke calmly, the way someone does when they know the truth is already sharp enough. The college fund created under my name 18 years ago was legally protected under a custodial agreement. The account could not be transferred, withdrawn, or reassigned without the beneficiary's consent once the beneficiary turned 18. A few heads turned toward me. I had turned 18 years ago. My father shifted in his seat. "That rule doesn't apply if the money is being used for family." My lawyer gently slid another document across the table. A withdrawal form, signed by my father, dated 3 weeks after my 18th birthday, and very clearly forged. Gasps rippled around the room. My brother leaned forward, staring at the page like it might explode. My father's signature was there, but beneath it was my name. Except it wasn't my handwriting. Not even close. My mother's voice cracked. That doesn't prove anything." My lawyer nodded slightly. "You're right, it doesn't prove everything." He flipped to the next page. which is why we also obtained the bank's internal verification records. That's when my father's face truly changed, because he knew what those records would show. Every withdrawal over $50,000 requires identity verification, and the verification video still existed. The bank had kept it archived. A quiet murmur spread through the room. My grandmother leaned back in her chair like someone settling in to watch the final act of a play she had waited years to see. My father's voice came out low and sharp. "You went to the bank." My lawyer didn't even look at him. "Of course we did." Then he turned slightly toward the television mounted on the restaurant wall and nodded. The screen flickered to life. The video quality was grainy, security camera footage from years earlier, but the image was clear enough. The date appeared in the corner, 3 weeks after my 18th birthday. The camera showed the interior of the bank office. A teller sat behind a desk, and across from her, my father, holding withdrawal papers, signing documents, confirming identity, taking money that legally belonged to me. The entire restaurant watched in silence. My brother slowly turned his head toward our father. His voice came out almost as a whisper. "Dad." My father didn't answer, because the video wasn't finished yet. The teller asked a question, something about beneficiary authorization. My father leaned forward and calmly said something that would echo through the room like a gunshot. He told the teller that I had agreed to transfer the fund to help support my brother's future. The lie sat in the air like smoke, and everyone knew it. My grandmother's smile grew just slightly, because the truth wasn't just exposed anymore, it was documented. And for the first time that night, my father realized this wasn't just family drama anymore. This was evidence. And the next thing my lawyer said made the entire room go still again, because he wasn't finished. Part 16. The screen went dark. For a moment, no one spoke. The quiet that followed the video felt heavier than anything that had come before it. It wasn't the awkward silence of a family argument anymore. It was the silence of people witnessing something that could not be explained away. My father slowly pushed his chair back from the table. The movement scraped loudly across the floor. "This is ridiculous." His voice tried to sound confident, but it carried a tightness that hadn't been there earlier. The kind of tension people feel when they realize the room has stopped believing them. He gestured toward the television. "That video proves nothing except that I withdrew money from an account I helped create." A few people shifted in their seats. For years, my father had been the kind of man people trusted without question. The successful businessman, the reliable community sponsor, the father who donated to school events and shook hands with the mayor. But tonight, that reputation had cracks running through it. My lawyer remained calm. He slid another sheet of paper across the table. "The bank doesn't see it that way." My father didn't touch the document. Instead, he looked directly at me for the first time since the video ended. "You're really doing this?" There was disbelief in his voice, not anger yet, just shock that I had taken things this far. I didn't answer. My lawyer did. The custodial account legally transferred to the beneficiary on the day he turned 18. From that moment forward, any withdrawal without his consent becomes financial misappropriation. A few people in the room quietly whispered to each other. My father's jaw tightened. Family money isn't misappropriation. My lawyer shook his head slightly. "Not according to the law." Then he tapped the paper. "This document confirms the account ownership transfer date. It also confirms that the beneficiary never authorized any withdrawal." My mother suddenly leaned forward. "This is insane. You're trying to destroy your own family over money." Her voice trembled with anger, but the room didn't rally behind her the way it once would have, because everyone had just watched the bank footage and everyone understood what it meant. My grandmother slowly lifted her teacup, taking a small sip like someone enjoying a quiet victory. My brother sat frozen beside my father. His face had lost all color. He looked from the documents to the blank television screen and finally toward me. You're saying Dad took your college fund?" The words came out slowly, like he was still trying to assemble the truth piece by piece. I met his eyes. Not just took it, used it. The room seemed to shrink around the table. My father's hands clenched. Enough. He stood up now, his chair tipped slightly backward before settling again. You want to play lawyer games? Fine. We'll settle it privately like a family. My lawyer calmly closed the folder. That won't be possible. My father stared at him. Why not? Because the lawsuit has already been filed. That sentence hit the room like a dropped glass. My mother gasped. My brother's head snapped up. Filed? My father's voice had lost its composure entirely now. My lawyer nodded. 2 months ago. You've been formally served. My father blinked. That's impossible. I never received. My lawyer reached into the folder again and pulled out another document. Certified delivery receipt. Signed by your office assistant. The date sat printed in bold numbers. My father stared at it. Realization slowly crept across his face. For the past 2 months, he had believed tonight's dinner was just a family birthday celebration. But the legal battle had already started. And he had been losing ground the entire time without even realizing it. My grandmother finally set her teacup down. The soft click of porcelain echoed through the silence. Then she looked at my father with a calm expression that carried decades of quiet disappointment, and she spoke just loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear. Actions have consequences. My father looked around the room at the watching guests, at the silent mayor, at his own son sitting beside him in stunned disbelief. For the first time in his life, he looked like a man who had lost control of the story he spent years writing. And the worst part for him was that this was only the beginning, because the next piece of evidence my lawyer placed on the table would make the entire town understand exactly how deep the betrayal really went. Part 7. The document my lawyer placed on the table didn't look dramatic. No bold red stamps, no threatening legal language splashed across the top. Just a clean stack of financial records printed on ordinary white paper. But sometimes the most devastating truths look ordinary. My father stared at the pages without touching them. What is that? His voice sounded smaller now, less certain. My lawyer answered with the calm patience of someone who had already rehearsed this moment many times. Transaction history. My father exhaled slowly. You already showed the withdrawal. Yes. My lawyer gently turned the first page so the numbers faced the room. But we haven't shown where the money went. That was when the tension shifted again. People leaned forward, because stealing money was one thing. But what someone did with stolen money, that was where stories really changed. The page listed a transfer amount, $175,000. The date matched the bank video. My father looked at it and scoffed, trying to regain control. That proves nothing. I moved the money to another account. My lawyer nodded slightly. Yes, you did. He turned the next page. The receiving account name sat printed in clear black text. The room read it at the same time. My brother's name. My brother blinked. Wait. He leaned forward suddenly. That's my college account. The realization came slowly to him, the same way it had come to me years ago. My lawyer spoke again. 3 days after the withdrawal, the funds were transferred into an investment account opened under your son's name. My brother shook his head immediately. No, that can't be right. He looked at my father now. Dad? My father didn't answer, because the paper didn't stop there. My lawyer flipped to another page. From that investment account, portions of the money were used over the next 3 years for several major purchases. A receipt appeared. Then another, and another. The room began recognizing them. The first one was the car. My brother's brand new car the summer he turned 19. A sleek black sports coupe everyone in town had admired. The second was tuition payments. Private university, out of state, paid in full every semester. My brother's breathing grew shallow. And the third receipt made several people in the room quietly murmur. A down payment on a condo. My brother's condo, the one he moved into right after graduation. Every piece of his early adult life had been built with that money. Money that was never supposed to leave my account. My brother pushed his chair back slightly. His eyes were locked on the documents now. Dad. Still no answer. My father looked like someone calculating 100 different escape routes at once. My mother tried to intervene. That doesn't mean anything. Families support each other. My lawyer nodded politely. Of course, but not with funds that legally belong to someone else. Then he tapped the final page. Which brings us to the total. At the bottom of the sheet sat a simple number. $175,000 principal, plus accumulated investment gains, plus legal interest, plus damages. The final number sat bold and unavoidable. $312,480. A low whistle escaped from someone near the back of the restaurant. My father's eyes snapped up. That's absurd. My lawyer remained calm. That is the current amount being pursued in the civil lawsuit. My brother slowly turned toward my father. His voice barely held together. You used his money for all of it? My father finally spoke. I did what was best for the family, but the words landed differently now. Because for the first time, my brother wasn't nodding along. He was staring at him like a stranger. My grandmother leaned slightly toward the table, her voice soft but sharp. Funny thing about secrets, they always feel safe, right until the moment they stop being secrets. My father looked around the room again. The watching faces, the whispers spreading from table to table, the mayor quietly slipping out the side door. His reputation was bleeding out into the room faster than he could contain it. And then my brother said something that changed the night in a way none of us expected. Something that made my father's face go completely pale. Because my brother had just realized something else about that money. Something far worse than simply where it came from. Part 18. My brother didn't look at me. He didn't look at the documents anymore either. His eyes stayed locked on our father, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in his expression I had never seen before. Doubt. Not the casual uncertainty people show during a disagreement. This was deeper. A slow, unsettling realization working its way through years of comfortable assumptions. He leaned forward slowly. The chair creaked beneath him. Wait. His voice sounded tight. If that money came from his account, he gestured weakly in my direction. Then that means... His sentence hung unfinished, but everyone in the room understood where it was going. My father answered too quickly. It was family money. But my brother shook his head immediately. No. His eyes flicked down to the paperwork again. The custodial agreement, the transfer date, the withdrawal, the bank verification video. All of it lined up with brutal clarity. He looked back at our father. That wasn't family money. Silence spread across the restaurant again, because when the favored child starts questioning the story, the entire structure begins to crack. My brother's voice dropped lower. That means the car, he stopped, breathing out slowly. The car everyone had admired, the car our father proudly helped him pick out, the car I remembered watching from the driveway while pretending it didn't bother me. My brother continued quietly. The car was his money, no one spoke. My brother's hands rested on the table now, fingers pressed flat against the wood. Then the tuition. He laughed once under his breath, a short, stunned sound. 4 years of tuition. Every payment, every semester, paid with money that wasn't supposed to be mine. My father finally snapped. Enough. His voice was sharp now. You're acting like I committed a crime. My lawyer didn't even blink. Legally speaking, that's exactly the question the court will decide. My father ignored him. He was focused entirely on my brother. Everything I did was for you. But my brother didn't look grateful. He looked sick. He rubbed a hand across his face, and the condo? His voice had dropped to a whisper now. That down payment. My father stayed silent. And that silence was answer enough. My brother leaned back slowly in his chair, staring up at the ceiling like he was trying to reassemble the last decade of his life with entirely new information. The condo he proudly gave tours of, the car he bragged about, the degree he hung on the wall. All of it built on money that had quietly disappeared from someone else's future, my future. Across the table, my grandmother watched him carefully, not cruelly, not smugly, just patiently, because she had always known this moment would come. Eventually, the truth always arrives. My brother lowered his head again. When he looked up, his expression had changed. He wasn't confused anymore. Now he was angry, but not at me. He looked directly at our father. "You told me the money came from an investment you made years ago." My father's jaw tightened. It did. My brother tapped the paperwork. "No, it came from him." The room felt colder somehow. My mother tried to step in again. "Honey, your father was just trying to..." My brother cut her off. "How long were you going to keep lying about it?" My father didn't answer, because he knew the worst part hadn't even been said yet. My brother leaned forward slightly and asked the question that had been sitting quietly beneath everything all night. If the money was his eyes shifted toward me for the first time. Then why didn't he get it? The room went still again, because that question didn't just expose the theft. It exposed the choice. My father hadn't just taken money, he had chosen which son deserved it. My grandmother slowly folded her hands on the table, and in that moment, the entire town sitting inside that restaurant understood exactly what kind of story this really was. But the night wasn't finished revealing its secrets, because my lawyer quietly opened his folder again, and the next piece of evidence he pulled out wasn't about the money. It was about something my father had done after the money was gone, something far more deliberate and far more damaging. Part 19. My lawyer didn't speak immediately. Instead, he let the room sit in the weight of my brother's question. If the money was his, then why didn't he get it? It was the kind of question that stripped away every excuse. No complicated legal language, no technical loopholes, just a simple truth that everyone in the restaurant could understand. My father shifted in his chair again, but the confidence he once carried into every room was gone now. His shoulders looked heavier. His eyes moved from face to face, searching for someone who might still be on his side. He didn't find anyone. My lawyer calmly reached into the folder again. There's one more thing the court found interesting during discovery. The word discovery made a few people whisper quietly, because anyone familiar with lawsuits knew what that meant. Evidence obtained legally. Documents people thought would stay buried. My father rubbed his forehead. What now? My lawyer slid a thin envelope onto the table. Inside was a printed email. The date at the top caught my attention immediately. It was from the same week the money had been withdrawn. My father frowned. That's private correspondence. It was retrieved through subpoena. My lawyer turned the page toward the room and began explaining. 2 weeks after the withdrawal, the university admissions office contacted your family regarding a delayed tuition deposit. A few heads turned toward my brother. He looked confused. My lawyer continued. They had received an application under your name, but the tuition had not yet been paid. My brother blinked. What? The room leaned in again, because now this story had a new layer. My lawyer tapped the printed email. The application wasn't for your brother, it was for you. He looked at me when he said it. I already knew where this was going, but my brother didn't. My father's chair scraped across the floor again. You're twisting things. My lawyer ignored him. He read directly from the document. The admissions office was following up regarding the enrollment paperwork submitted for the fall semester. The applicant had been accepted. Several people gasped softly. My brother's head turned slowly toward me. You applied there? I nodded once. Years ago, back when I still believed the college fund would actually exist when I needed it. My lawyer continued reading. The email states that the applicant's financial documents confirmed a college fund sufficient to cover the first year of tuition. He gently tapped the page. That fund was the same account your father withdrew from 3 weeks earlier. Now the silence in the room felt different, heavier. My brother's voice came out carefully. Wait, you got accepted? I didn't answer immediately, because this was the part I had spent years trying not to think about. Finally, I nodded. Yes. My lawyer placed another document beside the email, the acceptance letter, printed, dated, official. My brother stared at it like it was something fragile. You never told anyone. I shrugged slightly. There wasn't much point after the money disappeared. Across the table, my father suddenly slammed his hand against the wood. Enough of this. The sound echoed across the restaurant. People jumped in their seats. He pointed directly at me now. You're trying to make me look like a villain. My lawyer's voice remained calm. You withdrew the funds 3 weeks before your son's tuition deadline. You transferred them to your other son's investment account. Then you ignored the university's payment request until the acceptance expired. The words fell one by one like stones. The room understood what that meant. My brother looked back at the email, then at the acceptance letter, then at our father. His voice shook. You let his acceptance expire. My father said nothing. My brother's chair pushed back slowly as he stood. His face had changed completely now. This wasn't confusion anymore. This was anger. Real anger. The kind that comes when someone realizes they've been part of something unfair without knowing it. He looked down at our father. All those years you told me he never tried hard enough. You said he didn't get into any good schools. My father's mouth opened slightly. But no explanation came, because the documents were sitting right there on the table. Proof that the story our father had told the family for years wasn't true. My grandmother exhaled slowly. The quiet sound seemed to carry across the entire room, and then she said something that made the truth land even harder. Funny what happens when the wrong child is underestimated. But the most shocking moment of the night hadn't happened yet. Because my lawyer slowly pulled out one final document, and this one didn't just expose what my father had done. It revealed what had happened after I decided to fight back. Part 20. The restaurant no longer sounded like a birthday dinner. Forks had stopped clinking. Conversations at nearby tables had faded into low murmurs. Even the staff moved slower, glancing toward our table like they were watching a story unfold they weren't supposed to see. My father sat rigid in his chair. Across from him, my brother was still standing. And between them, the table had become something else entirely. A courtroom. My lawyer rested his hand on the final document, but didn't reveal it immediately. Instead, he spoke calmly, as if guiding the room through the last piece of a puzzle. When my client discovered the college fund had been emptied, he spent several years trying to understand what had happened. That much was true. Those years had been a strange blur of part-time jobs, night classes at a community college, and the quiet humiliation of watching friends leave for universities I once dreamed about. But the worst part wasn't the struggle. The worst part was believing for a long time that the money had simply vanished, that it had been some kind of mistake. My lawyer continued. Eventually, he requested the account records directly from the bank. My father scoffed quietly. Anyone can request records. Yes, my lawyer nodded. But most people don't receive a response like the one he did. He turned the final page toward the table. The document looked different from the others. This one carried an official seal from the bank's legal department. My father's eyes narrowed. What is that? My lawyer tapped the heading. Internal Investigation Report. The words alone made several people lean closer, because banks do not open internal investigations for small misunderstandings, my lawyer explained. When my client questioned the missing funds, the bank reviewed the withdrawal process. They confirmed the identity verification, they confirmed the transfer, but they also flagged something unusual. My father's breathing slowed, because he already knew what the report would say. My lawyer pointed to a highlighted section. According to the bank's compliance department, the withdrawal documentation included a signed authorization from the beneficiary, the same forged signature everyone had already seen. However, he paused. The room leaned forward again. The compliance officer, reviewing the file, noticed inconsistencies in the handwriting and requested further verification, which led to a formal internal review. My father's jaw tightened. My lawyer looked up from the paper. The bank concluded that the authorization signature did not match the beneficiary's verified records, which meant one thing: the room already knew, but hearing it officially still hit like a shock. The withdrawal had been approved using a falsified signature. Forgery. The word didn't need to be spoken. It hovered there anyway. My mother whispered something under her breath. My father finally spoke again, but his voice had changed. It sounded defensive now. Banks make mistakes. My lawyer nodded politely. That's true. Then he turned to the last page of the report, which is why they corrected it. My father blinked. Corrected what? My lawyer slid the page forward so the number at the bottom was visible. The bank reimbursed the missing funds to the original account during the investigation. The room froze. My brother looked confused. Wait. My father leaned forward suddenly. What are you talking about? My lawyer spoke clearly. 2 years ago, the bank returned the full $175,000 to my client's account after confirming the withdrawal involved a forged authorization. The number sat printed at the bottom of the page. Deposit confirmed, $175,000. The silence that followed was absolute. My father stared at the document like the ground had just disappeared beneath him. My brother looked between us. Then, why are you suing? My lawyer closed the folder gently, because that was only the principal amount. He turned toward my father. The lawsuit is for everything that happened after the theft. Legal interest, investment losses, damages, court costs, the total amount already announced earlier that evening, over $300,000. My father's face drained of color. You're saying his voice barely worked now. You already got the money back? I met his eyes calmly. Yes, that was the moment the room truly understood. This wasn't a desperate son trying to recover stolen money. The money had already been restored. This lawsuit was about something else. Accountability. My grandmother leaned back slowly, her expression almost peaceful, and my father finally realized something that made his hands tremble slightly against the table. Because if the bank had already replaced the money, then the person the court would come after next was him. And the worst part for him was that the entire town was about to learn exactly what that meant. Part 21. For several seconds, my father didn't move. The document sat in front of him, the bank's official seal reflecting the restaurant lights like something permanent, something that could not be argued away. Across the table, my brother slowly sat back down. The chair legs scraped against the floor, breaking the silence for a moment before it returned even heavier than before. You already got the money back. He said it again, quieter this time, like he needed to hear the sentence more than once to believe it. I nodded. 2 years ago. A few people in the restaurant whispered to each other. Some of them had probably assumed the same thing my brother had just assumed, that this dinner was about recovering stolen money. But that chapter had already closed. My lawyer spoke calmly. Once the bank confirmed the forged authorization, they were legally obligated to reimburse the original account holder while pursuing recovery through their own channels. My father looked up sharply. Recovery. The word sounded dangerous in his mouth. My lawyer nodded. Yes, financial institutions typically seek reimbursement from the party responsible for the fraudulent withdrawal. My father leaned back slowly in his chair. For the first time that night, he looked genuinely shaken. You're saying the bank came after me? My lawyer didn't sugarcoat it. They attempted to. Several people in the room exchanged glances. Attempted? My lawyer flipped open the folder again and removed another page. They sent 3 separate notices requesting repayment of the reimbursed funds. My father's eyes darted across the table. My lawyer placed the letters beside the other documents. First notice, second notice, final notice, each stamped with dates from 2 years earlier. My father's mouth tightened. I handled it. My lawyer tilted his head slightly. You ignored it. A quiet ripple spread through the nearby tables, because ignoring a bank is rarely a winning strategy. My lawyer continued. Eventually, the bank closed their recovery case due to the cost of litigation exceeding the reimbursement amount. My father's shoulders loosened slightly. There it was, the small piece of relief he had been hoping for. You see, his voice regained a hint of confidence. They dropped it. My lawyer shook his head gently. They didn't drop it. They transferred it. My father frowned. Transferred it to who? My lawyer turned the document around to the beneficiary. The room seemed to tilt. My brother looked confused again. What does that mean? My lawyer explained patiently. Once the bank reimbursed the original account, my client regained legal ownership of the funds. But the damages caused by the fraudulent withdrawal were never resolved. Lost educational opportunities, delayed career start, financial hardship. He looked directly at my father. Those damages became the basis of the civil lawsuit. My father stared at the papers, his fingers curled against the edge of the table. So this whole thing... His voice dropped lower. You planned it. I shrugged slightly. Not at first. At first I just wanted answers. That was true. Back then I had still believed there might be some misunderstanding, some explanation that would make everything less ugly. But the truth had been worse than I imagined. My grandmother spoke softly from the end of the table. Truth has a way of growing teeth when people ignore it. My father looked at her like he wanted to argue, but even he seemed to realize the room was no longer his territory. My lawyer closed the folder again. The court date is scheduled for next month. That sentence made the tension spike again. My father sat up straighter. You're taking this to trial, if necessary. My lawyer nodded. Unless a settlement is reached first. My father let out a short laugh, a bitter one. You think I'm going to hand you $300,000? I didn't answer. Because I didn't need to. My lawyer slid one last piece of paper across the table. Settlement proposal. The number printed at the bottom was slightly lower than the lawsuit amount. $295,000. My father stared at it like it was written in another language. My brother looked between us again, still struggling to process everything that had happened tonight. And then my father asked the question that finally revealed how desperate he was becoming. What happens if I don't pay? My lawyer answered calmly. Then the court decides. And if the court rules in our favor, he tapped the paper lightly, the judgment becomes enforceable. Asset liens, wage garnishment, property claims. The words landed one after another. My father's condo investments, his business shares, his savings, everything suddenly sat under a shadow. My grandmother slowly stood up from her chair. The room instinctively watched her. She looked at my father with the same quiet expression she had carried all evening. And then she said something that made the entire situation feel even more inevitable. You should have just given the boy his money. But what my father said next shocked everyone in the room, because instead of backing down, he decided to fight. Part 22. My father stared at the settlement paper for a long time. The number at the bottom seemed to pull all the light in the room toward it, $295,000, a figure large enough to change a life or ruin one, depending on which side of the table you were sitting on. For years, my father had built his reputation on control. Control of his business, his image, his family narrative. He was the man who always knew what to say, when to say it, and how to walk away from a problem before it grew too large. But tonight, the problem had already grown, and everyone in the room knew it. He slowly pushed the paper back across the table. No. The word landed flat and stubborn. My lawyer didn't react. Instead, he simply folded his hands together. You're declining the settlement offer? My father leaned back in his chair again, forcing a confidence that didn't quite reach his eyes. That's exactly what I'm doing. My mother looked alarmed. Honey. But he cut her off with a raised hand. I'm not paying nearly $300,000 because my son decided to turn a family disagreement into a courtroom circus. The word circus made a few people in the restaurant shift uncomfortably. My lawyer's tone remained steady. You're free to make that decision. Then he gently slid the settlement paper back into the folder. But you should understand the risk involved. My father smirked faintly. Risk? You really think a judge is going to award him that kind of money over a college fund? My lawyer tilted his head slightly. Not just over a college fund. He opened the folder again and turned one of the documents around. Over-documented financial fraud. The word fraud hung in the air. My father's smirk faded a little. My lawyer continued. And more importantly, over provable damages caused by that fraud. My brother finally spoke again. Dad! But my father ignored him. He was staring directly at me now. You want to do this the hard way? I met his gaze calmly. You already chose the hard way years ago. The words landed with quiet finality. Across the table, my grandmother watched the exchange without blinking. My father scoffed again, though the sound felt weaker now. You think the town is going to side with you? He gestured vaguely toward the surrounding tables. People who had been pretending not to listen suddenly found their drinks very interesting. But everyone had heard enough. I didn't respond. My lawyer did. This isn't a popularity contest. It's a legal case. My father laughed again. Short, sharp. Judges care about context. Family context. You were still living under my roof. You were still living under my roof. You were still part of this household. My lawyer nodded thoughtfully. Then he slid another sheet from the folder. Which is why we also prepared witness testimony. My father frowned. Witnesses? My lawyer tapped the paper. 3 of them. My father leaned forward. Who? My lawyer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly turned the document so the names were visible. The first name belonged to the bank compliance officer who investigated the forged signature. The second name belonged to the university admissions officer who had tried to contact my family when the tuition payment never arrived. And the third name made my father's face freeze, because the third name belonged to someone sitting inside the restaurant. My brother. He blinked. Me? My lawyer spoke calmly. You were unaware of the source of the funds used for your tuition and property purchases. But your testimony regarding the statements your father made about your brother's supposed lack of academic acceptance will help establish intent. My brother looked stunned. You want me to testify? My lawyer nodded. Only if necessary. The room went very still. Because now the real damage of this lawsuit became clear. This case wasn't just about money anymore. It was about forcing the truth into a courtroom record. And that meant my father's own son might have to sit in a witness chair and explain exactly how the lie had been told. My father slowly stood up from the table. The movement was slower this time, more deliberate. He looked at my brother, then at me, then at the stack of evidence spread across the table like pieces of a story he could no longer control. Finally, he said something that revealed exactly how far he was willing to go. If you think I'm going down alone, his voice dropped low. You're mistaken. The room held its breath, because the way he said it made it clear he was about to drag something else into the open, something none of us expected. And when he turned his eyes toward my mother, even my grandmother stopped smiling. Part 23. The moment my father looked at my mother, the entire atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. Up until now, the story had been simple in the eyes of everyone watching. A father had taken money that legally belonged to one son and used it to benefit the other. Ugly, yes. Yes, but still contained within one person's decision. But the way my father turned toward my mother suggested something far more complicated. She saw it too. Her shoulders stiffened instantly. Don't. It came out barely above a whisper. But my father was already past the point of restraint. You think I did this alone? The sentence landed like a dropped glass. My mother stood up abruptly. Stop talking, but the damage had already begun. My father turned back toward the table, his voice rising now, years of pressure cracking through the surface. You all want the truth tonight? Fine, let's have the truth. Several people at nearby tables stopped pretending not to listen. Even the restaurant manager lingered near the doorway. My lawyer watched carefully but said nothing, because sometimes the most powerful evidence is what people reveal themselves. My father pointed toward the documents on the table. Yes, I moved the money, but the idea didn't start with me. My mother shook her head violently. Don't you dare. My father ignored her. He turned toward my brother. You remember when your acceptance letter came? My brother frowned. Of course. My father laughed bitterly. You think that was the only letter in the house that week? The air seemed to tighten again. My brother slowly looked at me, then back at our father. What are you talking about? My father nodded toward the acceptance letter still sitting on the table. Your brother's acceptance came first, 3 days before yours. My brother blinked. That much he already knew now. But my father wasn't finished. Your mother saw it before I did. The room went silent. My mother's hands trembled slightly at her sides. My father continued, his voice colder now. She was the one who opened the envelope. My brother looked confused. So? My father's laugh held no humor. So, she was the first person in this family who realized there wasn't enough money for both of you. The words hit the table like a stone. My mother closed her eyes briefly. My brother's voice dropped. What do you mean, not enough? My father gestured toward the papers again. The college fund, $175,000, enough for one private university, not two. My brother's breathing slowed. So you're saying? My father cut him off. Your mother asked the question first. Which son should get it? The sentence was quiet, but it carried farther than anything else that night. Several people in the restaurant gasped softly. My grandmother's expression hardened. My mother finally spoke, her voice shaking with anger. That is not how it happened. But my father pressed forward anyway. You were the one who said it. He looked directly at her. You said he was the safer investment. The words echoed in the room. My brother froze. My mother looked like someone had been slapped. I never said that. But my father's voice was relentless now. You said he had the better grades. You said he had the better chance of success. You said the family's future would be more secure if we focused our resources on him. My brother slowly turned toward our mother. His face had gone pale again. Mom? My mother looked at him, panic filling her eyes. That's not... But the story had already taken on a life of its own. My father gestured toward me. You want to know why he didn't get the money? Because your mother thought you deserved it more. The room seemed to tilt. My brother looked like he had stopped breathing. My mother shook her head desperately. He's twisting this, But the silence around the table told a different story. Because whether the words had been spoken exactly like that or not, the choice had still been made. My grandmother slowly rose from her chair. Her voice, when it came, was colder than anyone had ever heard it. You both should be ashamed. But the night still had one final turn left, because my brother was staring at our parents now with a look that neither of them expected. And when he spoke next, the entire direction of the story changed again. Part 24. For a long moment, my brother didn't speak. He just stood there between our parents, his eyes moving slowly from one face to the other, like he was trying to understand how the ground beneath his life had shifted so completely in the span of one evening. The restaurant had gone almost completely quiet now. People weren't even pretending not to listen anymore. Because what had started as a tense family dinner had become something else entirely. A public unraveling. My brother finally turned toward my mother, his voice careful. Did you say that? My mother's lips parted, but no words came out at first. Her eyes moved from him to me, and then briefly to the documents on the table. Years of decisions were sitting there in black and white. I didn't mean it like that. The answer didn't help. My brother's shoulders dropped slightly, as if something inside him had just confirmed what he didn't want to believe. Then he looked at my father. And you. His voice hardened. You just went along with it? My father's jaw tightened. I did what I thought was best for the family. The phrase sounded hollow now. My brother laughed quietly, but there was no humor in it. For the family. He gestured toward me. You mean for me? No one corrected him, because the truth was obvious. My brother rubbed his face with both hands, pacing a few steps away from the table before stopping again. The car, the tuition, the condo. Every sentence sounded heavier than the last. I built my entire life on that money. He turned back toward me. Money that was supposed to be yours. I shrugged slightly. I managed, and I had. Not easily, not quickly, but I'd built something anyway. Night classes, freelance work, years of slow progress. And eventually the quiet determination to uncover what had actually happened to the future that had disappeared overnight. My brother walked back toward the table. When he looked at our parents again, the admiration he once carried for them was gone. You both lied. My mother whispered. We were trying to protect the family. My brother shook his head. No, you were protecting a decision. Then he turned toward my lawyer. That witness testimony you mentioned earlier. My lawyer nodded slightly. Yes. My brother straightened his shoulders. You can count me in. The words dropped like a final domino. My father's face drained of color. You're going to testify against me? My brother didn't hesitate, if that's what the truth requires. My grandmother let out a slow breath, something almost like relief passing across her face. Because in that moment, the last illusion inside the family had finally collapsed. My father looked around the room again, but this time there was nowhere left to look for support. The town had seen enough. My lawyer closed the folder. Then we'll see you in court. My father sat down slowly. The fight that once filled his posture now replaced with something closer to exhaustion. The birthday cake still sat untouched in the center of the table. The candles had never been lit. No one had even noticed. My grandmother picked up her purse. Before leaving, she placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. Justice takes patience. Then she walked toward the exit. One by one, the restaurant began returning to life again. Conversations restarted, glasses clinked, but the story had already traveled across every table in the room. By morning, the entire town would know. My father had spent decades building his reputation, but in a single evening, the truth had finally caught up, and this time there was nowhere left for it to hide.